we are going to talk a little bit about PAWs, or Privileged Access Workstations, which is something that my team builds a lot of these days, and something that I think you all should have as well. So just kind of a curiosity question. How many people have PAWs in their organization? A few. How many are thinking about it? And how many have no idea what I'm talking about? A couple. All right. So we'll level set there. So super important thing to have is that you have this concept of like supply chain security or clean source for everything that you're administering, all your IT assets. And we'll talk through what PAWs do and how they provide that. But certainly there's been various things in the news around supply chain security, things that have happened in the Middle East. Those things on a macro micro level can happen to you from an IT perspective as well, and PAWs are designed to protect against some of that. So won't go through the intro, but like Sean said, Brian Desmond, I work for a company called Ravenswood Technology Group based out of Chicago. And before we jump into PAWs, when we talk about privileged access, whether it's on premises, protecting AD, or protecting things like Entra and Microsoft 365, there's a lot of complexity. There's a lot of moving parts that go into actually doing this. And with that complexity, of course, you have to think, how much bang for the buck am I getting? What's the reward that I'm getting? So sometimes we use this chart to talk about some of these different controls, different protections. And as we get further on that complexity curve, is the reward actually there for what your organization can support? Whereas some of these are really simple to implement, simple to support, and there's a lot of reward for that. So we talk about things like LAPS, Local Admin Password Solution. Hopefully everybody has that deployed, but if you don't, what that does is it randomizes that local admin password on every single endpoint that you have, whether those are client computers, member servers, etc. And that makes it much harder to move laterally, because now if I compromise the hash from one of those, I can't just take that and hop to another machine. Some people say, well, I've got another tool that does that. That's great, as long as that tool doesn't do that in a way that you can derive what the password is from some knowledge of another computer. I've seen people have tools, they take a hash of the serial number and they add 3 to it, put the day of the week, something. Turns out the bad guy can figure that out too. You paid a lot of money for that tool and it's probably not actually doing anything for you. So that's a super simple one. Process changes are the hardest part about it. The next thing we talk about is putting tiering controls in. And those are really about preventing privilege escalation. So how can I make sure that if I compromise someone's productivity machine, their laptop, I can't get all the way up to being a domain admin? And so we put controls in place. Primarily those are done with group policy. And the idea here is that I can't use an administrative credential that's from a higher assurance. So tier 0 would be my domain admin account. That can never touch a lower assurance asset, like a member server that might be compromised in tier 1, or even a client computer, an endpoint in tier 2. Where this tends to get a little bit more interesting is when we talk about all the agents that are running, especially in tier 0. What are all those things that are running on your domain controllers, your PKI servers, your Azure AD Connect servers? Are there endpoint management tools that can run code, distribute software? Are there SIM agents that can actually run code? Now, if I can compromise any one of those, now I can compromise the assets that they're running on. So you may think of that endpoint management tool as something that's primarily run by your desktop or end user support organization. But if that can push code onto a domain controller, turns out they're really domain admins in disguise. So that's another one. That tends to be a much harder web to untangle, but a lot of value for actually figuring that out. And then the next one, PAWs, we're going to talk about quite a bit today, so I'll skip over that for now. And then the final thing that we do where complexity starts to get a lot more interesting is putting actual separate admin forests. You might have heard it called a red forest, an ESAE model, something like that in place to provide just-in-time access. So nobody has standing access to, as a domain admin, standing access to member servers. For many organizations we work with, the complexity of doing that is just not worth it in terms of what it takes to manage. So that's what we start to see is that curve flattens out. What's the kind of the bang for your buck that you're getting? like I said, today we're going to talk. We're going to focus on privileged access workstations, and what we'll talk about a little bit today. We'll talk about what they are, why they're important, and we'll talk in some level of detail about what are some of the pieces that we actually put into those PAWs when we build them, and some of the ingredients that you need to think about if you want to put a PAW program together. So like I said, it's all about having that what we call a clean keyboard. We know exactly about the whole history, everything that goes into that laptop, that endpoint that you're using to do that management. The laptop that you use to read your email, to surf the web, to do all your day-to-day tasks, the assumption is that that's inherently compromised. Whereas a PAW, we're putting in all these controls to ideally make that really, really hard for someone to gain control of that. And so with that, the other thing we're doing, we're all humans, we're preventing people from making poor choices. Sometimes those are intentional, sometimes those are cutting corners because, hey, I've got something to do, I need to get it done quickly. Other times it's just that nature of being human. You know, a story I'll tell, so Sean alluded to, we've got a couple dozen people that work on these things every day in our organization, and they're super technical. They're really, really good at what they do. And like hopefully all of you, we have a third-party vendor that we hire that runs these little phishing simulations, and they send out emails to everybody. And yeah, sometimes they're not so great. I got one the other day that had the new emergency evacuation plan. Turns out I work from home, so wasn't super compelling. But we also had a bunch that came out that purported to be from people's managers, and I can tell you the data was really poor when I saw it, even with a highly technical group of people that should know exactly what they're looking at and all the risk signals in those phishing messages. So you think about someone clicks on one of those, they're actually malicious, they compromise that endpoint they're using to do privileged tasks to manage systems. That could work out really poorly. So one of the controls we'll talk about, of course, that we block things like email, we block internet access on the PAWs to prevent access to some of those threat vectors. And then just briefly, because I alluded to it, what is just-in-time access? What does it do? The idea is that now nobody has standing privileged access to these systems they manage. Maybe you have a team of 10 people that have access, that have domain admin access, but chances are, vast majority of the time, they don't actually need that. So why don't we make it so instead they have to elevate? And now if there's a credential theft scenario, those credentials are only good for a very small amount of time. We also can put controls on how they get privileged access. Do they need to use a PAW to actually elevate? We know they're coming from a trusted source. And another one that's super helpful, actually finding out who's using the access they have so we can claw back access that's not necessary. Because of course, anytime you ask someone in IT, hey, do you need that? Of course they need it. But when the data doesn't support that, it becomes a lot easier to claw that back. So as we go through this, one of the underlying things through this entire discussion as we go through all the different pieces here is this concept of clean source, or the clean source principle. And if you think way back to maybe high school or grade school math, maybe they talked about like this concept of transitivity. But if we think about all the different control paths that you have, one control path is that laptop that you're using to do a remote desktop session. What about the things that are actually touching that laptop and controlling it, that endpoint management system that's distributing patches, that's putting software on it? The idea is that if one controls the next, then of course it controls the one after it. And this is one of the reasons that we need PAWs, so that we can isolate and have that clean source. So the example here is super abstract, but if we flip to a different way to look at it, this is a compromise that we've seen more than a couple times in customers. But think about, you don't have PAWs, you're using that same laptop you use for everything else to do all your tasks every day. Then you've got an endpoint management system, an SCCM, a Intune, Altiris, pick your vendor, it really doesn't matter. The common thing that they all have is they've got some sort of agent that runs on the systems that they manage. That agent has complete access to do whatever it wants, like install software, run scripts, run programs, you name it. So now if I compromise that endpoint management system, it becomes super simple to compromise the workstations that IT are using. And in turn, I can use that to compromise my sensitive systems, be that Active Directory, be that line of business applications, Office 365, you name it. And so that's where this whole concept of clean source comes into play and is super important. And as you go through designing these programs, putting the controls in place, balancing risks that you're going to take, because I can promise you, every time we do one of these projects, a corner gets cut somewhere. Like, it is just too hard to do this perfectly for all but a handful of organizations that can operate at the scale that it takes to cut every single vector out. So inevitably, there's going to be some place where you're going to say, we're going to accept that risk, but fundamentally, you have to think about what control influences am I putting on these devices by accepting those risks or not. So another just kind of example I'll go through that we sometimes talk about is, so we usually talk about the laptop, the workstation that you use every day is that productivity computer, that thing that you use to write Word documents, open emails, surf the web, do all your day-to-day work. Those are used by all sorts of different teams in IT. And there's all sorts of different ways that we can go after those laptops. They're not isolated at all. And because of all those different ways, if I'm the bad guy that wants to do that, I've got lots of opportunities as well. So if we start with one of those vectors, it doesn't matter which one, we go after that productivity laptop, we see it get compromised, someone now has control of it. Of course, now what's going to happen, someone with privileged access is going to sign into it, because that's the first thing you do when you sit down every morning, you sign in, you start doing your work. Now I have capabilities to do whatever I want on it. We've seen people do things as simple as like reading keystrokes, using it to run scripts because your token is elevated, remotely controlling sessions, remote desktop sessions, absolutely things that happen. Whatever the case is, when that happens, they're probably waiting for you to connect to whatever resource they're going after. Common targets, your PAM system. I'm sure many of you have those. Many of them create all sorts of new and interesting attack vectors, which is a conversation perhaps for another venue. Or maybe these are server admins that are actually managing the underlying VMware or Hyper-V or whatever your virtualization infrastructure is that something like AD runs on. So now they have access, not directly to AD, but they have access to the storage that's under it. They have access to the hypervisor. And it turns out you can do interesting things with that. One example, this has happened more than a few times. People go after the backups that your Active Directory is stored in. Inside that backup, of course, is that NTDS database file. Of course, there's something really important in there that you don't want to lose. All the password hashes that apply to every single user, every single computer in your organization. Now, through compromising that productivity laptop, I've gotten to the storage or the hypervisor that AD runs on, or in this case, I haven't even necessarily gone after AD directly, but I've gone after those backups. And I have all those password hashes. And now I can do all sorts of malicious things with that. And that all started because I had this machine that was compromised and was used every day by someone in IT. And in this case, in this example, not even someone that had domain admin access necessarily. So, one of the solutions to this, or part of the solution, of course, is these privileged access workstations, these PAWs. So there's a couple different ways that we typically build these. That's evolved a little bit, and we'll talk about some of what that evolution looks like. The super simple way, you've got your productivity laptop, and then you get a second laptop that is the PAW. That's the easiest way to go about building these. There's a bunch of other pieces we're going to talk about in a minute that go into these. Some people complain about this. Hey, now I've got to carry two different laptops around. That's harder. There's scenarios where you don't need just one PAW, but maybe you need multiple PAWs. I can tell you I have people in our organization that have a stack of laptops sitting on a desk in their home office that's would make Best Buy jealous. That's not necessarily the easiest for people to work with, but at the end of the day, if you're starting simple, you're starting small, this is the easiest way to do it. The other way that we sometimes do these is we think of the PAW laptop as more of like a thin client, and we use it to access different VDI or virtual desktop systems. One of those is that they can use that to do their productivity work in an isolated VDI environment for those things like email and so forth. And then there's a second one that is used for actually doing privileged access tasks. And it's really important with this scenario that nothing can ever come out of the connection to those VDI systems. Because if I can take something from that remote desktop session where I'm surfing email and put it on the PAW, now I've broken that whole clean source model. And the flip side of this also doesn't work. We get asked all the time, well, hey, I've already got this laptop. How about we build this privileged access VDI or virtual desktop solution, and we'll just remote desktop to it from that productivity laptop. And the whole clean source model is broken there, because if anything happens in the session that's making the remote desktop connection, then that compromises that VDI session as well. Like I said, there's other ways to do these, but these are typically the two models that we take. The standalone one is the really straightforward way to start, and then you can always iterate from there. We typically, when we build these, we say, let's start with our tier 0 admins, and for most organizations, that's a really manageable population. So we're talking about buying tens or dozens of PAWs, not hundreds or thousands. You can build up very quickly if you decide to give PAWs to tier 1 admins, those people that run your member servers as well. But from a starting point, again, this is the easy way to do it. So what are some of the things that we typically put into these? And we're going to dig into a bunch of these in detail, but there's a few I'll call out here. This one should seem like a given, but just to call it out, everyone has to be a normal user. They can't have local admin on the PAW. That breaks the model if you can do things to compromise it through a vector that's that simple. The next one, and this is where these projects tend to get interesting and sometimes cause a lot of head scratching. You can't have your desktop team manage the PAWs unless you're also going to think of them as domain admins. Because anyone that has management access to the PAWs, if these are managing tier 0, they're managing your AD, they're also, by definition, at that same level. And this creates lots of interesting scenarios, because it turns out most people that manage things like AD, Office 365, other high assurance systems, they're not desktop support admins. And guess what? I just put you into the desktop support business. Congratulations. So thinking about what that management model looks like is an important organizational and skills thing that you have to figure out up front. And for some organizations that we work with, they end up adding headcount that's dedicated to managing this as these PAW programs grow. And obviously there's financial impact there's operational impact, and so forth. Another one is around restricting internet access. We'll dig into this, but you shouldn't be surfing the web with these. There's a bunch of different solutions depending on how you go about that, but they're not necessarily easy, and they also take dependencies on other teams in your organization that you might not work with that often, especially people that support things like networking, firewalls, and so forth. We'll talk about management stack, how we actually need to get applications on there. The last thing you want is people putting their favorite tools on. It turns out that putting that Notepad++ and all the other widgets and fun stuff that you download from the internet, that breaks that whole supply chain security discussion falls apart right there. So of course you don't want people doing that. We're going to put controls in place to block that. Then also thinking about what are actually the trusted tools, trusted media that we're going to deploy onto the PAWs. And then physical security of these things is super important. Like from the point that they're manufactured to when you get them, when does that seal get broken? At what point do we say that we can't reuse this? This is no longer something that we trust to use as a PAW. Are all decisions that you're going to have to make, and that are going to impact what your processes look like. So if you've had PAWs for a while, the way we do this and the way Microsoft builds these, other organizations, has evolved a bunch. For us and many organizations that we do this with, during COVID and changes to work from home, made a lot of changes to how this was done. But when we first started doing these, you re-image these desktops or these laptops using a clean image. They were done in a secure workspace, typically in an office. They were distributed in person. And that's great when everybody's in the same place. It gets really hard when you have distributed IT teams. They're in the US, they're in Europe and Asia. Now you need different places to do this. Or you're getting really friendly with your favorite FedEx guy, which the costs add up super quickly there. So what we've evolved to, and we're going to walk through what the architecture for this looks like, is what we call these concept of modern managed PAWs. And there's some risks that we've accepted as part of doing this, but now what we're doing is rather than using all that traditional on-premises disk imaging and infrastructure to support that, we're provisioning these with Windows Autopilot. They come out of the box, they boot up, they talk to Intune, they download all your policies, all your settings. They're joined to a special secured Entra tenant that's used just for managing these, that's specially secured. And what this makes much easier is we don't have this kind of monolithic infrastructure support, and we can support remote and distributed workforces. So we're going to talk through a little bit of what goes into this. So when we build these, like I said, these are all through kind of this concept of modern desktop management, and I realize that this is potentially a bit of a different ecosystem that many people in the room aren't used to working with, because hey, you're not supporting endpoint management, desktop, that sort of stack. But at the core of this, we use a dedicated Entra tenant that we use just for PAWs. Sometimes we also do some other interesting things around tier 0 there, but for the purposes of this discussion, we really use that just for managing the PAWs. Those PAWs are Windows 11 devices. They have all the enterprise licensing with E5 and all the fun stuff that comes with that. We actually land a set of Microsoft 365 E5 licenses in this tenant, so it has totally separate from your production tenant. Some people will ask, well, why don't I just use that existing production tenant that I have? Because hey, we have Intune, we have Entra, we're already paying Microsoft for all the bells and whistles. And that really goes back to that clean source discussion. Now I have all these different teams, all these different people in your Intune environment that have access to influence these PAWs, to enact change on them. And typically that breaks that concept of clean source. So like I alluded to, we use Intune, which is part of that package to actually manage the PAWs. They use something called Windows Autopilot. If you're not familiar with that, at a high level, what happens is when you order the devices from the OEM, they give you a list of serial numbers, or what actually are called hardware hashes. Those get uploaded into this Intune tenant, and there's some magic glue in the out-of-box experience that happens when you open up a new Windows device and it asks what kind of keyboard you have. Do you want to connect to your Wi-Fi? What's your favorite language? All those questions you've been asked countless times. Once you get the networking going, it calls home and reports that serial number, hardware hash, that identifying information, and it goes, oh, I'm registered in Autopilot, so I'm not going to ask you the rest of these questions that you usually get asked. Instead, I'm going to download all the configuration and bootstrap the device, and it's going to pop up joined to this Entra tenant, ready for you to sign into with the credential that's provisioned there and with all the policies that are defined. So that makes this much easier to handle with a distributed workforce and so forth, because people don't need to come into an office, go through all this kind of monolithic provisioning. There's some other tooling, from an EDR perspective. We typically use Defender for Endpoint because it's part of the stack, but if you use CrowdStrike or PAW or pick your favorite vendor, that works there too. Just think again about that concept of clean source. If you have lots of people that can access that portal to manage that tool, and typically those tools can run code on the devices that they manage, are you breaking that clean source model? We want all these devices reporting all the telemetry from them. We use Sentinel, but if you use a different SIM like Splunk, that works too. Again, clean source, Splunk in particular, can run code unless you disable that on the agents. That can cause some consternation and so forth. And then all the different Windows Enterprise features. We're going to walk through some of these in a couple minutes, but those all get used to actually secure the device and really lock it down and harden it. And then finally, some way, somehow, it's going to have a set of tunnels back to that on-premises network that you're managing, and we'll dig into that as well. So you get one of these things, from however boxes come to you, from the FedEx guy, UPS, whatever. What's super important is you want to start out with a clean, trusted device. Taking another laptop that's in that big stack behind the help desk, or however your organization provisions hardware when people get hired, they get a hardware refresh, however that process works. Typically, none of that process works for PAWs because you have no idea what's happened to that device between the time that it was received, people have had it, it's been returned to the stack, something happened to it, the list goes on and on. So we always tell people you want to buy new hardware for this. We also tell people, hey, why don't you choose hardware that doesn't overlap with what you give to all your end users, so that you know which ones are the PAWs. If you only give out Dell hardware for sake of discussion, buy HP hardware or Lenovo or another brand for the PAWs and so forth. Somewhat cynically, we often tell people to go buy Surface devices, because it turns out that not many organizations seem to buy those in bulk for their people. So it's really obvious to know that, hey, those are the PAWs over there. Someone gets one of these, we want to make sure is that seal's not broken, doesn't appear that it's been tampered with, and so forth. They plug it in, and the device goes through that autopilot process that I described and bootstraps itself, configures them as a local user on the device, and give it half an hour, and it's ready to go. But the key takeaway here again, from a supply chain security perspective, you're making sure that you're starting with known good, clean hardware to the best you can, and anything that's already been used is a no-go. Walked through most of this, but as far as that, how do those what are called hardware hashes, those serial numbers, information about the devices get uploaded? There's different ways you can get these into Intune. It can suck a CSV file in if you already have them. The other thing that you can do is whoever you buy these from, whether you get them from like a CDW or an Insight, or you call Microsoft, you get them from Dell, however you get them, they can all be set up to have a relationship with your Intune tenant, whereby when you order a stack of laptops from them, they can actually have those ingested into the tenant, so that by the time the person receives the device, it's already in the tenant and it's ready to be bootstrapped. You don't actually have to do anything to upload any of that information about the devices. So kind of the next one is, okay, now I've got this device, and great, it's got Windows on it, we've pushed some configuration down to it, but it turns out there's some applications we need, some other things we need to do to it. How do we know that we can actually trust the binaries that we're going to put on there? And we have this process that we walk through where you're going to have to get that from a trusted vendor. At the end of the day, it's coming from somewhere. Has that been scanned with a scanning tool? Are digital signatures valid? Code signing on there? Typically, you can also get file hashes that you can validate. Does this actually match what they said it does? And then that actually comes into that provisioning environment for the PAW. Typically, that's into Intune. However, it gets transferred to that destination. You get to do that all again to make sure nothing got tampered with along the way. And now you have a certain degree of comfort or confidence with the data that or the files that you're starting with. Won't go through this, but this is just a sample of how Microsoft provides these hashes for all the files that they make available in the licensing site. There's a PowerShell script there you can use to actually validate that. Whether it's Windows, which doesn't really apply here because we're using Autopilot, or whatever binaries you're putting on there, at the end of the day, those are all subject to being checked in the same way, and having that level of trust, that level of familiarity with what's going on onto the devices. The other thing you get to do is, it turns out that Windows comes out of the box with a lot of extra stuff. Everybody has a different opinion about how valuable some of these things are, but I would venture a guess that for the average PAW, you probably don't need the Xbox Music app. Fun fact, it's called Zune Music there, if anyone remembers one of those. All sorts of other fun stuff here, the weather, the news, etc. We typically use Intune to push a script down that just rips all of this valuable stuff that Windows comes with out, so that you're starting with a relatively clean slate. Another really important control is, like, how are we actually doing whitelisting for the apps and binaries, kernel mode code that's running on the PAWs? That's something that's typically really hard to do on a typical end user device. Like, that list, especially in an organization of any size, would just be miles long. You'd never be able to manage it. Of course, there's people that will tell you they can sell you something that will do that for you. That's wonderful. Windows actually comes with something. It's had all sorts of different names. Right now, it's called App Control. At one point, had a few different names, but the important thing here is that it lets you whitelist actually what code can run on the device. There's kernel mode code, those are what drivers can run on the device, then user mode as well, what What applications can you run on there? Depending on how you deploy this, you can make this really tamper resistant. You can actually sign that manifest. It gets injected into the device. There's a process called measured boot, something that Windows has. The TPM is involved. Someone can't actually change this without replacing it with another manifest that's been signed with the same certificate. A lot of protection that comes with this. Also makes it really easy to turn your entire fleet of PAWs into bricks. That are very difficult to unbrick. So the testing and quality assurance that goes into if you decide to go down this path is non-trivial. Especially when you start thinking about patching, because you can actually, depending on how you set this up, you can not whitelist the files that come with Windows, and Windows will no longer boot up. So that of course is bad. Changes happen, patches come out every single month. Either way, you need a testing process. But if you go down the path of doing the whitelisting, you absolutely have to have a real test plan for this, because I guarantee you at some point, some patch will come out that will break that whitelist that you have, and you will find yourself with those test devices being completely useless. We typically do this with what we call rings. The number of rings varies a little bit. We usually start with 3, but the idea here is that we stagger out the patching. So that ring 0 right on patch Tuesday, or patch Tuesday plus 24, somewhere in there, automatically gets patched. That's going to be your set of canaries, if you will, that are going to tell you if something has gone really sideways. And then we have a couple rings after that, a couple days out, maybe 5 days out, and by that point, everything has been patched. This is super simple to set up in Intune through the quality and feature updates and so forth, the policies that they have there. You can target those to different groups. You can use dynamic groups in that Entra tenant to make sure that you've got that final ring catching everything minus the devices that are in your test rings. However you do it, at the end of the day, A, you want to get those patches out there quickly, because we want to make sure that these devices aren't vulnerable, and B, we want to make sure that we're not going to brick them with some of the security controls that you may have on the PAWs that probably nobody else out there has on typical devices. So when you're reading all the internet chatter about what happened on Patch Tuesday, probably the number of people that are going to be impacted by interactions with some of the tools that you're using is really slim, which means hearing about that might be a little bit harder. So next big one is, how do we actually isolate these devices from untrusted networks? How do we keep them off of the internet? I think it goes without saying, but I say it anyways, you can't use these things to browse the internet. But of course, then you're going to ask the question, well, hey, what about using these to manage my Office 365, to manage Entra? We've got some trusted SaaS applications that we're actually putting on in Tier 0. We want to manage those with the PAWs. Of course, you have to do that over the internet. That becomes a little bit of sometimes a bit of a chicken and an egg problem. Historically, the way we've done this is Windows and other operating systems have this thing called a pack file, which is this wonky flat file format that the browser and the operating system knows how to decide what proxy server to talk to for different destinations. And when you have a short list of destinations, it's not completely untenable to actually have a whitelist there. And then what we do is we say anything that's not in the whitelist, the proxy server is localhost, which means it goes nowhere. Of course, these things, they're not fun to manage. Every time you have to update it, you have to distribute those updates. That pack file actually needs to be stored on a location that's accessible. The list of why it's not particularly fun goes on, but it works, and it works well if you get the management model done. We're starting to evolve how we do this. There's something relatively new that's in Entra called Global Secure Access. This is part of Microsoft's Zero Trust networking play. You might also hear this called SASE, or like a Secure Service Edge. Think of Global Secure Access at a really, really high level as like a web content filter. There's a lot more going on there, but if you wanted to sum it up in a few words, that's the way to do it. It lets you use conditional access policies to define what users and what devices can go to what and how and so forth, which is great. There are still some challenges that this has. It's super new, so while we're hoping to switch from the pack files to it. One of the many wonderful features of it right now is that you can right-click the content filter and say exit, and then you can browse anything. And you can kind of complete the dots on why that might be bad. We have a lot of customers that have Zscaler. It can do similar things. Again, just thinking about clean source, do you need a separate instance of Zscaler? That covers the internet side. The other part is how do I get this onto an on-premises network? So I need to connect to domain controllers. I need to connect to servers, whatever these things are going to manage. The simplest way is VPN. We'll walk through how we typically do that. VPNs can be hard. They can also be subject to breaking that whole concept of clean source because they can download new packages, they can install things. You have other teams that either manage that, or we have some customers that stand up separate VPN infrastructure just for the PAWs. And then it becomes this interesting discussion of, well, do we give PAWs to the networking team who are all wondering, well, what are these things and why do I have to use it? Or does our AD team, who just became a desktop support team, perhaps something that they're not happy about, also get into the networking business? Two things that they have no idea how to do and probably have the opportunity to cause some trouble when they mess it up. Again, the other part of that solution that Entra Global Secure Access is part of is something called Entra Private Access. You can, again, use conditional access policies to actually define paths and tunnels. So what subnets and what ports can these PAWs connect to? And the fun thing with that one is that we can actually use device compliance, which is a signal that we get to from Intune about the health of the PAW to determine if they can actually connect to that endpoint. Zscaler, other SASE tools is another one that works there. And then we alluded a little bit to using VDI. So the PAW is more of a hardened terminal that you use to actually connect to a virtual desktop infrastructure. Maybe that's Windows 365, VMware Horizon, Azure Virtual Desktop. Kind of pick your flavor that's secured so that you can only connect from the PAW, and then that becomes the jumping off point to those traditional on-premises networks. If you do the VPN approach, which is typically what we do, there's a couple things to know about or to highlight here. One is that any of the kind of modern commercial VPN systems can now do SAML, so you can actually federate that VPN endpoint with that Entra tenant that your PAWs are joined to, and you can apply a conditional access policy. So you can say, hey, I can only connect to this VPN by using these credentials. And by the way, I need to be coming from a device that's marked as a PAW. And by the way, that needs to be compliant in Intune. So now I've made it much harder to actually get over the hump, if you will, to actually connect to that VPN endpoint, which is then going to provide that jumping off point to some of these highly trusted resources. There's also something baked into Windows called Always On VPN. There's little plugins you can get for most of the traditional commercial VPN solutions that plugs into there. The nice thing about it is that the device boots up, it's on the tunnel, it's not riding an untrusted network. The not so nice thing is actually getting it to work will perhaps make you reconsider some of your career choices and what you want to do in life. So whether you want to actually figure out how to get that going is up to you, but it is there and it does add some value. Kind of the last major piece I'll cover, this comes up all the time, is great. Now I've got this hardened device, it can't connect to anything, we trust it, it's great for managing all these highly sensitive assets. But what happens when I need to actually move some files in and out? I've got a support case open with someone. How do we share screens? I've seen customers that have none of this before, where they've got like a camcorder on a tripod aimed at the PAW, and the guy like a world away is trying to watch that through a screen share. Productivity is super low there. So typically what we do, because we have those Microsoft 365 licenses in that tenant that's hosting the PAWs, is we will enable a very locked down version of Microsoft Teams that can only connect to or only federate with certain places, and it makes it so that you can actually do screen sharing, you can share text-based data. Sometimes files need to come in and out, log files have to get to support organization, updates need to get in. That's one of those places where risk and the risks you're accepting start to be something that you need to think about, but that's typically the vehicle that we use to enable some of those kind of collaboration scenarios, especially when you're working with vendor support and so forth. So just kind of wrapping this up, hopefully everybody sees the value in having these. We think that everyone should have privileged access workstations, PAWs, to isolate all of that administrative access, isolate exposure to privileged credentials. But at the end of the day, that concept of clean source principle is super, super important. And if you're not respecting that, not thinking about that as you build and design this PAW infrastructure, chances are you will probably neuter it somewhere along the way, and then the value of the whole thing becomes really suspect. As you build this, thinking about the people that manage it, the organizational changes that are involved, this can be just as hard as actually getting all the technology going. I've mentioned it a couple times, but having an identity team, a security team that's suddenly in the desktop business, in the networking business, in the in some ways in a help desk business for their peers in IT. The organizational change, the skills that are involved in that, all of those things are really, really hard to manage, and something that you don't want to save for the end of the project. Oops. Go back. There we go. And that's what I had as far as prepared content. We've got 4-ish minutes. I'm more than happy to grab a couple questions if there are any.
There's Ben with the first one, but this is very much all about the 3 legs of people, process, and technology. You've got to have all 3 of those or it's just not going to work.
This is very true.
Hey, Brian. Can you come back in your slides to close to the beginning when you had the managed PAW? Please.
Tell me when to stop.
Yeah, it's pretty far up. Yep.
Yep. Okay.
Quite a few questions on this one. Question with, so you said dedicated Entra tenant, right?
That is typically what we do.
All right. So I have a question for you for chicken and the egg question.
Yep.
How do you build your dedicated Entra tenant when you don't have a PAW yet?
Yeah. How do you build the Entra tenant without the PAW? How do you build the PAW without the PAW? We typically just use a clean laptop out of the box, and there's a level of trust and.
All right, but if you're doing something on-prem that you could have dedicated hardware on-prem, meaning dedicated PAW, dedicated servers, closed lab, build everything locally. Whereas what you're saying is you're taking a basic empty machine and connecting to the internet, and going on Entra and going for a subscription and everything.
Yeah, and we'll land the template pack file on there so it has limited internet access.
Okay. So that was part 1. Sorry. Are there any questions? Because I have like 3 on this one. All right. The second one is, so you have your dedicated Entra tenant. So fine, everything, you have the whole stack, Microsoft stack. Second question would be, why, if you have a source of trust, nothing can come in, nothing can come out, is there really a purpose of having an EDR? That would be number 1. Second of all, you're using SIEM, but then who's checking the logs and how? Would it be the tier 0 team or somebody else has access to your Sentinel?
Yeah, so I guess the EDR one is the, why not? Good luck having that conversation that, hey, we have these sensitive assets. And if someone does find a way to compromise it, then why not have the, have the mitigating control there? So I guess that's how I'd look at that. We typically see a SOC team looking at the data from the SIM. Sometimes that gets forwarded. We'll put a fair bit of alerting around that, around certain kind of behavior-based patterns and so forth, as well as just simple things like, hey, we shouldn't hardly ever see new users, new devices, authentication methods, those sorts of things change.
Okay, and then just a quick last one is, so let's just suppose that everything went well, your device is clean. Which identity are you using to connect to your on-prem resources?
Yep. Yeah, that's a good question. So how do you connect to on-prem resources? So in the model where we just use the tenant for the PAWs, there is a logon that happens in the Entra tenant, and then you are using that admin credential that is for on-prem resources that is managed through other processes. The footnote that's not on the slide. We have other organizations where they will have a what we would call a tier 0 forest, an admin forest that is actually linked to this Entra tenant. And so you're signing into the PAW with that credential, and then there is a process for you to elevate and use that on-prem.
Yeah, but you're cheating because you're using ESA, is what you're saying. So your tenant is linked to your red forest, and
it's linked to an ESA
and
style.
then you're using shadow principles, and then you're cheating your way in. But if you don't have a red forest,
then they use their tier 0 cred that's managed no different than if you didn't have
locally.
PAWs. Yeah.
Okay. Are there any other questions, or can I go with the last one? All right. If you move down in your slides, sorry, I had another question close to the end. Oh, there was one for the no. Go down. Sorry.
They only give me one button, so I can
All
go.
right. No, I had a question on that one, but I'll ask it afterwards. Yep. Just above. Yeah. So we're hardening the workstations. We're making everything sure that you can't connect to anything. You can't do anything. But right now you're talking about file transfer.
It happens, like at the end of the day.
But you did talk about a gateway to bring things in, right?
Yep.
Why don't you use the same thing to bring things out?
Talk about a gateway. I'm not following that one.
So you wanted to download files and you want to put files on your PAW, right? But you
Yep.
have to download it from 2 different sources, check the hash, do tons of stuff, and then sort of bring them in.
Yep.
So you can have like a file transfer, thingy where you put your files and then somebody else has to approve it, bring it on the other side, and then somebody else has to take it and copy it on the PAW.
We
You
do
could
that for some percentage of these.
So that was one. And then the screen sharing one, you were talking about a video, but you can also go with streaming devices.
We have seen those as well.
That's what we use.
You can buy widgets on Amazon and from other mysterious places that will mirror your display port to something else. Sometimes we see those also get blocked by the time you put all the hardware blocking controls in.
Right.
So there are various ways to go about this one.
Yeah, that was one of the ways that we do it. But and tons of other questions, but no time for them. Sorry. But thanks for the answers.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you. Thanks very much.